Hello and welcome to the Being an Engineer podcast. Today we have the privilege of speaking with Steve Gompertz, who is a highly experienced leader in quality systems management and regulatory compliance, currently serving as a partner at QRx Partners. With a career spanning over 30 years, he has held significant roles in various companies, including Pelican Biothermal, St. Jude Medical, Boston Scientific, and Medtronic. At QRx Partners, Steve specializes in quality systems development, project management, and engineering automation, helping companies navigate complex regulatory environments and enhance their quality management systems. Steve, thank you so much for being with us on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Well, what made you decide to become an engineer?
It was almost more of a whim, but it stemmed from growing up. I liked anything technology. I kind of grew up at the beginning of the space age. So I wanted to be an astronaut originally, really.
Yeah.
And then somehow I ended up wanting to be a geologist, and then I found out they don't make any money. Then I got into cars, and I thought, I want to design cars. I guess you become an engineer to do that. And so, I went off to college. Actually, initially, I applied to be an electrical engineer, and I ended up graduating as a mechanical engineer. So, our lives always take these weird turns, and when you're that age, you're not particularly mature yet. I don't think a lot of thought goes into it. It's just sort of, where does the breeze take this leaf, right?
Yeah, it's kind of funny and a little scary almost that we have to make such a major life decision at such a relatively young age, right?
Yeah, I remember getting to college, and during freshman year, we had this engineering 101 class. And part of it was every week they brought in a different department head to talk about the life of that type of engineer. And like I said, I had gone in as an electrical engineer, and 2 weeks in, the head of the electrical engineering department does his presentation. And that's when I was first in a panic, because I was like, that doesn't sound at all like anything I want to do. Now what do I do? I'm here at college, and I hate the idea of what I signed up to be. And then luckily the next week was the mechanical engineering department head. And I went, that sounds really good.
Nice.
I'm going to switch over to mechanical engineering. But then what's funny is I've never held a position as a mechanical engineer.
Okay. I was going to ask, you kind of got into engineering because of cars. Did you ever work in automotive?
I did not. So, what I was in love with, I think, was the shape of cars, not like I'm a motorhead. I have a high performance car. But I wanted to design the shape of cars. And at the time, I didn't realize there was like this thing called industrial engineering or industrial design that just wasn't a major then, which is really what I probably should have gone into. And I got out of college, and I got a job as a software engineer developing computer-aided engineering applications for electrical design. Of all things. So I never really got away from the electrical side of things, but here I am with my mechanical degree, and I'm coming up with tools for electrical engineers. It all worked out.
So looking back over your career, if you had it to do all over again, would you make any different choices as far as like fundamentally what your expertise, your background is in?
No, it's been a great career. It's been fun. It's been a great ride. We've gotten a chance to do a lot of really interesting things and become an expert in a number of areas. And I've been able to change that, over time. So no, I wouldn't change a thing. I suspect if I had been aware that there was this concept of industrial design, I probably would have gone down that path and maybe stayed in that. But I wouldn't have ended up where I am today, loving what I'm doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things that you are an expert in is regulatory compliance. Can you tell us just a little bit about what even is regulatory compliance within the context of medical devices? And then what have been some of the big changes that you've seen in that field over the years?
Yeah. So the idea is, right, when you're doing something that can have, adverse effects on, patients and the people using things like medical devices, so your medical professionals or even lay people, obviously the government steps in and goes, look, we need to make sure you're doing this right? The words safe and effective are what drive everything in that industry. And to make sure that there's no, wiggle room there, they're going to go, we're going to give you the regulations and tell you exactly how we want that done, or at least here's the guardrails, right, and the constraints that you have to operate within. And so as a consultant, what I do is help make sure companies understand how to interpret that. And in med device is actually pretty hard because the concept of a med device is so broad, the regulations are not particularly prescriptive. Everything from a tongue depressor to a piece of software is a med device, right? So how would you write prescriptive rules for how to manage those different things, and pacemakers and heart valves and catheters? So the device side of things is actually pretty complex, and that's where consultants like myself come in, is to go, all right, we need to look at your situation, read between the lines and go, here's what they're going to expect, or how they're going to expect you to apply this rule, which doesn't give you a lot of detail, and make it work, and drive you to make sure that you've got a safe and effective device. I think what's changed a lot, obviously 34 years into med device after 7 years in computer software, I think, obviously there's been a lot of change. One that comes to mind is kind of the globalization of regulations. It used to be, it wasn't that other countries didn't have their own regulatory processes, but not all of them did. And whatever countries did have them basically just copied the US FDA. Now, over time, as they've matured and they've started to realize what do they want out of this, they're not all going, FDA doesn't always get it correct, at least from our perspective. And so we're seeing, a lot more proliferation of regulations where countries have taken the time now to understand what do they think it requires to protect their populations, from the manufacturers, make sure the manufacturers do the right thing. So it's been interesting to see that evolution of the regulations in different geographies, and to see some of them, like particularly in Europe, to see it really starting to take the lead. Where now that's kind of what everybody's copying and where things are going, and where it's a lot harder. Used to be, it was considered the FDA was pretty tough, and it was hard to get devices into the U.S. market. So you always went somewhere else first. We're actually seeing that is now completely switched. A number of our clients are Europe-based, and they don't want to get on the Europe market. They want to get on the U.S. market because it's now the easier market to get into.
I've heard a number of people comment about the increasing, what's the word I'm looking for? Severity is not quite the right word, but I guess strictness of the guidelines imposed by regulatory bodies, the FDA. Do you think that we've struck a good balance at this point, or is the balance tipped towards the side of maybe it being too robust a set of regulations and it's impeding innovation?
No, I don't think it is impeding innovation. I mean, the manufacturers are always scream, this is going to slow us down, and you're just going to make it harder for patients to get the benefits. But I don't think there's any data that actually supports that that's happened. When you look at, like I said, the EU medical device regulations are certainly more prescriptive, and you might consider them more burdensome. They're tough. They are definitely tougher. But when you study them, you go, but they're right. It should be hard, right? If I'm going to put a pacemaker in somebody's body, that shouldn't be an easy thing to get on the market, right?
Yeah.
And as we advance the technologies, and now you add in things like AI and ML, it's getting much more complex. And you're going, there probably should be some really tight rules about this. So I think they're on the right track, and that's why other countries are now following the EU's lead, and I suspect the US will as well in the not too distant future. It might have some impact, on cost, of design and development for new devices. But again, it probably should be hard for certain, right? And everything gets classified, right? So if you're class 1, low risk, you're making tongue depressors. The rules haven't changed, and everywhere it's still pretty easy. You get the class 2, class 3, and then some go to 4 levels or 5 levels. But as you go up, the risks go up.
Yeah.
And not surprisingly, then, the hurdles get higher, as they should. And if you want to play in that field, then you should be prepared for what it's going to take to get there.
Sure.
You can't come up with a new implantable device and think that that's going to happen in 6 months. Right? I know your engineers could probably do a design in 6 months, but they have to prove that it works, right? And that it doesn't do any harm.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. The trade-off between speed, aggressiveness of your development, innovation, and the need for, rigorous quality control. Is there a project that you're able to share where you had to help a company strike some balance between the rigorous quality control and innovation and developing something quickly? And how do you find that balance?
Yeah. Well, I would say every project, right? Everybody, like, businesses are in business to make money. On the opposite side, the regulatory bodies couldn't care less how much money you make, as long as what you do doesn't cause any harm. So it's always that balancing act. And, part of what we hope we provide is finding the correct pathway, because there are multiple pathways. There's not a one size fits all in the regulatory world. And you can definitely put yourself on a pathway that's too hard and harder than it needs to be. So we help companies try to see the right place. But then once we realize, look, this is the appropriate pathway for you, then it's like, there's no getting around this. And that's when you get the chance to challenge, their company ethics on things. Do they get it, that they're going to have to do the right thing here? My experience is most companies understand that and are fine with that, and they might make the right decisions. But you definitely see where they struggle with, should we really reduce that risk? Well, the requirement is that you will. You can try to dance around it, but at the end of the day, you can either deal with it now, or you can go down the pathway and at the last second of FDA deny you access to the market because you didn't do the right things. And that usually, if you've got people who are at least going to do the right thing for the right reasons, and that threat of that they're going to put all this money into it because it's not cheap, to get a device on the market, and there's that possibility that the FDA will say no, that hammers home pretty quickly. They get that. And they go, yeah, I could have dropped millions of dollars by not taking the right advice and suddenly find that I'm nowhere near the finish line where I thought I was going to be. So they usually get it. So you can usually turn that, if you want to use the word greed, right, or the desire to make money, into the driver that gets them to do the right thing, right? They want to do that sooner, but you go, well, we could jeopardize the entire investment if you don't do the right thing. And they usually get that.
You've worked at some large medical device companies, Boston Scientific, Medtronic, who, of course, have their own procedures and protocols for how they do quality and adherence to regulatory requirements, things like that. There are also lots of companies out there who are small, startup medical device companies who have to go through the same, have to adhere to the same FDA regulations. But I have to imagine that in a small startup, things are a little bit different than in a giant company like Medtronic or Boston Scientific. How has your experience working for these larger companies influenced your overall approach to quality management and regulatory compliance?
Yeah, it's important to understand, there isn't a one size fits all. And when I've, before I became a consultant, when I've worked or applied for jobs at smaller companies, they'd often, I'd meet with the CEO or the head of quality, wherever I was going to report to. And they'd always say, you're not going to come in here and put a Medtronic sized quality system in place, are you? Because we're not Medtronic, right? And I go, I understand that, right? And no, there isn't the one size fits all. I'm not, just because I was at Medtronic doesn't mean that that's all I know. And I'm going to put their system in place here, because you're right, that won't work for you. And it's part of what we offer to our clients today, where QRx focuses on small to medium companies. And we make it clear that we see this as an evolution. When you're in the pre-revenue stages and you don't even have a prototype yet, you do need some parts of your quality system. You don't need the whole thing. And the parts you have don't need to be quite as robust yet. That will come over time, and we'll evolve the system with you as the company evolves and succeeds. And then as you get bigger, that adds different levels of complexity. When you get the multi-site, multi-nations, then your quality system has to evolve. It's one of those things. One of the requirements is that you have to do periodic reviews of your quality system. And you're looking at the 3 points are, is it suitable? Is it adequate? And is it effective? Everybody gets the third one, effective, right? Does it work? It's the suitable and adequate is where your kind of wiggle room is, where that's the regulatory bodies and the standards bodies saying we're not going to give you a one size fits all, but you need to figure out what is it you need to achieve the intent of this standard or this regulation. So it's always about right sizing it to the company and the point in time. But there's so many variables, things like the risk of the device. If you're a small startup and you're developing a new neurological device, to some degree, it doesn't matter that you're not Medtronic. What you're doing is just as hard as what Medtronic would do in that same space.
Yeah.
And so they can't really back off, the regulatory bodies can't back off the rules for you just because you're small.
Right. Still has to be safe. Doesn't matter how big your company is.
Right. And there's there's what they call the acknowledged state of the art, which is different than the normal, definition of state of the art, which we think of bleeding edge. In the regulatory space, recognize or acknowledge state of the art means what's common right now. And you have to at least do what's the current standard of care. And it doesn't matter how expensive that's going to be for you and how big you are and what your resources are. You can't come up with something less than what's already on the market.
Right.
So that's one of the barriers, that might seem unfair, but on the other hand, you go, if I'm a patient, that's kind of what I want.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. What are some of the common pitfalls that you see companies falling into, and how can they be avoided?
Yeah. A lot of times, startups are often, some bright engineers. They've got a brilliant technical idea and they don't really understand the quality and the regulatory requirements. And they're not thinking about the why and the how. When they're thinking of the how, they're not thinking about the why and the what behind them. And so you get this sort of checklist mentality. Just tell me what they want me to do. What documents do I need to produce? What activities do I need to perform? And you too often see that, and that's how the quality system is built, is just around sort of this checklist. Do this, then do this, do this. And nobody's thinking about the reason why they're doing those things. And that's really where the importance lies, because it isn't just a matter of having these deliverables at the end of the day. It's how you got there, right? That it's part of a process. And the whole thing is a system, and all the pieces have to work together. And so too often what I see is nobody's taking that process view, that system view of their quality system, and it's just a pile of procedures and activities that are not really well connected. And then they can't figure out, why is it not very efficient? Why does it not seem to produce the right results? It produces results, but we still have recalls, or we still, run into problems where our tests fail and it's slowing down our ability to get on the market. It's because you didn't take a chance to step back and see the bigger picture. It's hard to see the whole system, right? But we often talk about, companies will sub-optimize, right? Because they get focused on one process to go make that perfect. And I was just on another webinar today, and I've been using this in an article I've got coming out soon, where I talked about it's, kind of like, I want my car to be higher performing, and I'm driving an economy car. Putting racing slicks on the back of that economy car isn't going to make it go any faster or perform any better. Matter of fact, it might work against you, right? As a mechanical engineer, I can think of the stresses you're going to put on the axles and the drivetrain, and will they fit in the wheel wells and things like that. And too often that's what happens in quality systems, is we don't take a look at the entire car. We look at this one piece that's maybe not working well, or that's the part we know and we want to make that better. And that's the only thing we focus on. And then we're wondering, why doesn't that work with the rest of the system? Well, it's because you didn't think about the rest of the system and connect it all together.
So talking about the entire system, obviously, quality control system is a large, complex thing, or at least it can be. And the scope of our conversation today will not allow us to get into every detail of that. But if you could, can you kind of pick out like the main components and walk us through what does it look like establishing a quality system? And earlier you mentioned that, pre-revenue, early stage development phase, you don't need the full system in place, but you need some parts in place. So kind of walk us through the evolution of, starting a new medical device design, and what are the kind of the core elements we need to have in place, and at what points do we need to start putting those core elements in place?
Yeah, so it's funny that I mentioned I was working on a webinar today. It was one that our company was putting out, and we were talking about all the foundational or fundamental issues behind all these standards and regs. And one of the core, pieces of that, or tenets, is this process approach. And what that comes out as, a lot of people are familiar with this concept of plan, do, check, act, the PDCA cycle, known also as the Deming-Shewhart cycle. And that's what every quality standard and regulation is trying to tell you to do. You have to plan for what you're going to do, right? You have to then do it, right? Execute to your plan, monitor what you're doing, get some data and check, and then act on that and make an improvement, update the plan, do it again, check it again, right? And that's where continuous improvement comes in. That's the basis for every quality system, and that's why you need to see the connection points. Now, getting started, right? Yeah, you don't need all of the components yet, and maybe you're not ready to do, right? And maybe there's certain pieces of check or act that aren't ready yet, but there are certain basics. We like to say in the regulated space, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. So doc control and records control is one of the first things you put in place. First, you architect your system. You write a quality manual and you say, this is what we think our quality system needs to look like so that it's suitable and adequate for what we're doing. And then the next thing is we have to control documentation and records. We have to be ready for that. Then it's, we're going to design something. So then we need design controls. What is the design and development process going to look like? But we don't need to worry yet about production controls. We probably don't yet need supplier management till we start farming any work out, because we're probably not going to build a factory right away. We're probably going to bring in contract manufacturers. But that's what I mean, the evolution, right? First, get our stuff under control. Does management understand its responsibilities? Do we know how to manage our documents and our records? Do we know how to do the right things in designing and developing our product or our device? Then it's like, okay, now we think we've got a design and we want to start building it. Now we need to engage contract manufacturers, component suppliers. So now we need our supplier management process in place. That's the next step. And maybe at some point then we're going to go to full production either ourselves or we're at our contract manufacturers, but we're going to need production controls, and then you keep building those pieces. We don't need complaint management yet because there's nothing on the market for people to complain about yet, right? So don't implement that until you're actually in the market. We don't need post-market surveillance because we're not on the market yet. But when I talk about the evolution, that's what it looks like.
Cool.
At some point, once you're on the market, then the entire system has to exist at that point.
Yeah. Great summary. All right. I'm going to take a short break and share with the listeners that the Being an Engineer podcast is brought to you by Pipeline Design and Engineering, where we don't design pipelines, but we do help companies develop advanced manufacturing processes, automated machines, and custom fixtures, complemented with product design and R&D services. You can learn more at teampipeline.us. The podcast is also sponsored by The Wave, an online platform of free tools, education, and community for engineers. Learn more at thewave.engineer. All right. We have the privilege of speaking with Steve Gompertz today. And Steve, can you share with us maybe a couple of the key trends in medical device regulation that companies should be aware of in the coming years?
So like I said, I think the EU is going to drive a lot of the direction here. And one of the big things that changed with the new medical device regulations that came out in 2017 was more of a life cycle view. If you look at the FDA regulations and a lot of countries' regulations and what was in place in the EU before, it was all about how do I get on the market? And then there was a little bit what happens after the market, right? And then they started to go, well, yeah, your responsibilities don't end when you cash a check because somebody bought your device. You have a responsibility once that device is on the market and out there and in somebody's body or being used over time. So they definitely added a lot more requirements around. So yeah, post-market. Now here's a whole bunch of other things. You are nowhere near done with your responsibilities. And it's actually pretty complex now. And like I said, I think that's where everybody's going to go because they realize, yeah, these devices, they last longer, right? When you get an orthopedic implant now, right? They can easily last 20 years. You get a pacemaker and the battery technology keeps getting better and the intelligence and the firmware keeps you from overusing the available, energy in the battery. So now, the pacemakers can easily last 12, 15 or more years.
Wow.
Well, that's a long time, that's going to be in somebody's body. You need to account for how are you going to deal with that in the future. And stay on top of how that device performs. Because of course it performs great when it goes out the door and at its first implant or first use. But once that pacemaker is in somebody's body, what is it doing 5 years from now, right? How do you prove that it will continue to do that? That it'll perform as designed, for that time. So I think that's, that shift in thinking is a big deal. And of course the one that's, hot on the presses right now, of course, is AI and ML. Every device, every segment of the device market is now affected by this. Devices that before never saw, a volt of electricity now have sensors and software associated with them. Things like, implantable orthopedic implants were always purely mechanical. It was all about, biocompatibility and mechanical stuff. Now they're building sensors in them. And they can transmit information about your movements and your joints, right, to software. And that software is probably now going to have an AI element or a machine learning element so it can interpret what it's getting from you. We are starting, right, to see the device start to take on some of the role of the medical professional. And that definitely scares the pants off the regulatory bodies, machine learning in particular. AI is interesting. A little short aside here. AI is not new, right? We think it's new because it's in all the press, but the term itself goes back to like the 1930s. And really any advanced, or complex piece of software could be considered AI, right? It's the machine learning that makes the difference. And in the regulatory world, what they're used to doing is having you prove my device does this within these constraints. And they go, yes, that's what we agree to. We approve or clear you just for those things, what's called the intended use. And it stays that way. And if you want to change any of that, you have to go back through the process. Now you're telling us you're going to give us a device that on its own will change and go outside those guardrails. The regulatory bodies don't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the new frontier. It's all very exciting because there's a lot of good that can come out of that. But right, it's stuff we don't fully understand yet. We see it if you play at all with any of the AI tools out there, and they talk about now they hallucinate, right? They come up with information that's not really reliable. I just saw a term slop, that they don't necessarily get it wrong, but the data they're basing it on is not particularly good, right? Garbage in, garbage out kind of thing. So the technology itself is not really advanced far enough, and we don't have very good control over it. And I think, that's what worries the regulatory bodies. And I think that's the next big challenge here. The other one that's really a hot topic these days is cybersecurity. That's become a huge, requirement, with FDA. And I'm sorry, my camera just went fuzzy there for some reason. But they're very serious now about making sure that if you're using any sort of software with your device, that you have addressed the security issues that, regardless of whether it's connected to the internet, right? There's still the worry somebody walks up to it and gets into the software and changes things.
Sure.
So that's become a big part of doing your submissions to the regulatory bodies, is demonstrating how you're dealing with cybersecurity.
Going back to AI for a second, you may or may not have any direct experience with surgical robotics, but I think that's a really interesting area where AI is going to play a huge role, because now you have intelligence in these surgical robots that can assist the physicians, the surgeons, in making decisions, right? The robot might see something in the body that it connects with 87 other things it knows about this data that it's been programmed with, and the surgeon might not necessarily make those connections, but the AI in these surgical robotics might. And then either suggest something or just do something. Do you have any anecdotes or any commentary about AI specifically within the context of surgical robotics?
Yeah, and I don't know that it's pertains only to surgical robotics, but I think that is a good example, right? The AI again has great promise for things it can do, right? Because it can pull together pieces of information at a faster rate and see trends that a human might not pick up on. But in the end, it's not much different than being the surgeon themselves, right? Every surgeon doesn't operate at the same level of proficiency and competency. They've all had different experiences based on their different, patients, and what they know is different, right? And they do their best to share that information through articles and conferences the way all of us do. I think the benefit is AI can at least put all that together and not lose it, right? And actually, but it also then comes down to, well, wait, what were the experiences the AI learned from? The same as if the surgeon only ever, operated on white males, right? What does it really know about the full patient population that robot's going to be, operating off of? And the same thing as you feed the data, the training database to AI, diversity is becoming a big concern there. Again, garbage in, garbage out. So how do you make sure that the AI is seeing a broad enough spectrum to make these right decisions, and that the information is not being fed any bad information? Because there's certainly, I teach at one of the local universities, and I warn my students about even just getting on Wikipedia, right? Forget about all the AI stuff they can do now. But I always remind them, I say, even if you're just Googling and you're getting a list of white papers, some of them are pretty awful white papers. They sound wonderful and the people seem to have the right credentials, and they come to the wrong conclusions, right? Now you've got artificial intelligence, and if you're letting it gather all of that information, even the bad stuff, it's going to make some bad decisions, right? There was, the article just last week about Google and its new AI, right? And the question about how can I make sure that the cheese stays on my pizza better? And it suggested glue as part of the recipe, right? That's what I mean, right? And then they went back and looked at it, and they said, because it picked that up somewhere where, for whatever reason, whether somebody was being sarcastic in a post somewhere or actually meant it, and the AI picked up on that and went, well, I saw it online, it must be true. The same way we do
right.
That, right?
It's funny now when we talk about it, but not so much when the robot cuts your spleen out unnecessarily.
Exactly, right? And that's the challenge. And that's what the regulatory bodies are trying to figure out, is how are we going to get control over devices that are utilizing this? There's a framework that's being developed around that. They don't necessarily have the regulations yet, but they understand the types of controls that are going to need to be in place. And it boils down to, we're not going to be able to allow device manufacturers to have machine learning based tools, or devices that are just free to update themselves as they go. I always refer to it, they're going to have to phone home.
Yeah.
You have to get permission. So they can capture this information, and at some point the manufacturer is going to be required to review, all right, device, what is it you think you've learned? And then weed through, no, don't use that. Yes, you can leverage that. And then we can go back and tell FDA, here are the things we're going to let the device change.
That makes sense.
You have to still control your releases of the design changes.
Sure. Right. All right. Well, can you talk to us about maybe a success story where your company, QRx Partners, has helped a company improve their quality management system, their regulatory compliance? Maybe walk us through what that process looks like, if you can, in the context of a story that you can share.
Yeah, we had a client that was growing pretty quickly, and they were really outgrowing their quality system. What they had in there was pretty typical of when they were in a startup. It was almost more of a facade, right? That checklist. Yes, we have a quality system. Yes, we have procedures for this. And they hadn't really thought about how to use them and why. And as the company was now growing, right, that was great. It was okay when there were like 20 employees, and now there's 250. And the whole thing is now caving in itself, and we're asked to revamp this quality system. And it was a complete rewrite, basically. We're going to burn it down and start over, thinking about the system and all the processes. Now, what was indicative was when we came on board, they had just come out of an FDA inspection. FDA left them with 4 inspectional observations. They were certified to ISO 13485, which is the quality standard for medical devices. And so they went through annual audits from their certification body. And those audits typically produced about a dozen to a dozen and a half major findings
That sounds like a lot. Is that
That's
a lot?
a lot. That's a lot. Yeah, that is a lot. And then they were doing some internal audits, and they weren't doing a great job of internal, but even their internal audits were identifying like 24 issues every year.
Wow.
Right. So that's a whole bunch of things that need to be fixed. And it's expensive. That's a lot of resources, right? It's a lot of time to investigate those, figure out the root causes, figure out the right solution, put the solution in place, prove that the solution worked. Right. This is why non-conformances are expensive. So we came in and said, look, we're going to burn the entire quality system down, rebuild a new one that is all connected, as I've talked about. We're going to show you how the process interconnect. We're going to teach everybody about the why. Right? There's a difference between education and training in an organization. I train you to follow a work instruction, step 1, step 2, but I have to educate you on why you're doing that. Right? Why does this regulation exist this way? Why does the regulation say it that way? Why are we designing the process that way? That creates awareness of what the risks are. All right. And risk-based thinking is a big part of that. We built that into the quality system as well. But we built this much more holistic quality system where now everything is interconnected. We've done a better job of educating the employees on their role and why they're, doing things within the quality system, including employees who didn't think they were part of the quality system, like sales never sees themselves as part of the quality system, yet they're a huge part of the quality system. And now you've got everybody truly engaged. This takes time. This didn't happen quickly. This took about 3 years to make this evolution, which happened to coincide with the next visit by the FDA. And there were 0 findings.
Wow.
And over that 3 years, they got down to the most recent, at the time the FDA came in, the most recent certification body audit found 1 minor nonconformance.
Amazing.
Now, internal, and we taught them to be more critical of themselves. They were still generating a lot of internal findings, but we were classifying them as, well, what kind of finding were they? Typically, what an auditor looks at is 3 things. 1, did you understand the requirement? 2, are you actually following the procedure? And 3, does that produce good results? You don't want number 1 because it means you don't understand the requirements, right? And that was the thing. A lot of their findings were of that kind of first level, that they weren't even understanding the requirements. Number 2 is not great because it means people aren't really paying attention to the procedure. They're not executing to what's documented. But that's correctable. And then number 3 is kind of like, this is where we get refinement and optimization. And so you'd prefer that you find mostly in that 3rd level. And that's where they got to. So they were finding a lot more stuff on their own, but it was all typically at that 2nd and mostly at that 3rd level. Yes, we understand the requirements. We're never finding instances where we don't understand the requirements. We're almost always following that procedure as written, right? Or we know how to change it as needed, right? If conditions change, because they will. And now we're down to refinement. Are we really as efficient and effective as we would like that process to be?
Yeah.
So that was a huge evolution for them.
Yeah.
But
what a win.
I don't have the numbers at hand, but I did a workup of the cost savings, and it was hundreds of thousands of dollars a year.
Wow. Incredible. Yeah. That makes it pretty easy for you to market, right? I mean, look what we did for
right.
this other
It's the
company.
Typical cost of poor quality, and it's just amazing, what that can cost.
Yeah.
And versus what it cost, and it sounds like a lot. It was my 3 years of work to burn down a quality system, redo it, re-educate everybody. But that avoidance of several $100,000 a year easily paid for it.
Yeah.
And this is why Philip Crosby, who is one of the quality gods, his book was "Quality is Free," and that's what he was talking about.
Yeah.
That cost of poor quality is always going to be more than what it's going to cost you to get it right.
And that maybe doesn't even account the new opportunities that they may have been able to pursue because those resources were freed up to spend time on other stuff.
Exactly, right? Your resources are now not distracted with redoing things, right? Rework is always bad. Right? This is a form of rework. If I have to go in and correct or, figure out new corrective actions for my processes that should have been right in the first place, those resources are not working on the things that would generate money. Right.
Well, I imagine there are going to be folks listening to this episode who say to themselves, this sounds like an interesting path. I might like to pursue this or learn more about it. What do you think are some of the most important skills or attributes, behaviors that quality management professionals need to have in the medical device industry?
So that I talked about the systems thinking, right? You have to be able to see broadly and see the entire system. And that's hard, right? It's complex. And, I always say it's the proverbial sweater. You pull the thread and the whole sweater comes with you. That's what a quality system is like. But you have to understand, if I pull this part of the thread, what's going to come along with it? So being able to see from a systems perspective, and then you're always a problem solver. So excellent problem solving skills is going to be important, because there's no point at which you declare success and then go, we're done. We have the perfect quality system. Some sort of condition, some variable is going to change tomorrow, and some part of your system is going to break. Right?
Yeah.
The rules are going to change, the conditions are going to change, or whatever. And then with problem solving, the most critical aspect of problem solving is root cause thinking. And if you don't actually get to the correct root cause, your solutions will never actually solve the problem. And that's the hardest one. And actually, that comes back to, did you even define the problem correctly? Right? So those are the kind of skills. Can we get past the symptoms and what I call the apparent causes and see the system and figure out where the root cause actually lies? Because the root cause is almost never where you observe the problem.
Interesting. That's great. All right. I think just maybe one more question here and then we'll wrap things up. This is one I've been asking most of our guests recently. It's something that I am very interested in. What is one thing that you've done to accelerate the speed of engineering? And most folks, when I ask this question, they're answering from maybe more of a kind of broader, more general context. But you and your experience that's very specific in the quality control world, I imagine you might have some answers that are, very specific to quality and regulatory and how those things actually speed up the engineering process. You talked about how quality is free. Well, that's probably because it allows you to move faster in some sense. But don't let my comments influence you. What's one thing that you've done to accelerate the speed of engineering?
I would actually go further back in my career to, when I was transitioning into the medical device industry and I was still doing engineering automation tools, but now turning that more into project management techniques. And these were the early days of what we called then concurrent engineering. Right now, we always have multifunction teams, right? Cross-functional development teams. Back in the 90s, that was a new idea, and it was not obvious that was a good thing to do. It was complex. This idea of getting away from the throw it over the wall. Engineering keeps engineering until they feel like they're done, and then they'll throw it to manufacturing and operations and get things done. Why would we want to involve them up front? We're just going to waste their time because we don't know what this thing is yet and what it's going to look like. Now we know better, right? And so that, right, because they're going to learn and they're going to help you come up with a good design that's actually manufacturable, serviceable, whatever the downstream needs are going to be. And it will accelerate. But at the time, this was pretty controversial where I was trying to push for this idea of we need to engage, these downstream, functions, early in the process. It was a tough sell. Project managers, this kind of blew their mind because it meant that there was going to be work that they would throw away. It was going to be more iterative, right? And so a lot of project managers just balked at it. It sounded kind of risky because it wasn't very linear. And how am I going to manage my budgets? And so try to convince a VP of development that they should put their career on the line for this new idea was difficult. I eventually found a guy, a product development director who had a small project that wasn't really considered business critical. And he was kind of given carte blanche to figure out what he needed to do. And, this was pacemakers, and a typical pacemaker budget at the time probably would have been on the order of $3 to $4 million over about a 3-year period, something like that. And he was supposed to be developing a simpler, cheaper pacemaker to go into underdeveloped countries where they don't have healthcare coverage and insurance, right? So how do you deliver a pacemaker that's the same cost as a refrigerator so that the family can decide, do we get a new refrigerator or do we buy grandpa a pacemaker, right? And so he had about $1 million budget and a year and a half to figure this thing out. And he had heard about some of my ideas, and I was demonstrating them on some of my IT projects of getting multiple functions involved. And he said, you know what, I think I get this. I'd like to try it on this project. Can you help guide me through it? And so he was very open to taking the risks. And we talked about, here's what the team needs to look like right up front. And we're going to need to bring these people in. And there were people in those downstream functions who were waiting for these invitations, right? They were really happy to hear, you're finally going to let us talk up front? Great. I want to be on that team. So we did that. We ran it from everybody's in the pool at the same time, right from the start. We're going to iterate. Yep. You know what? That didn't go the right direction. We're going to take a step back. Oh my gosh, the Gantt chart went in the wrong direction. And then we're going to go forward again and back again or forward again, right? And that kind of thing. And it sounds like that would be really wasteful. At the end of the day, the project took 9 months, did successfully produce a device, and I don't think he used more than $600,000 of that budget.
Wow, really? Huge savings.
That got people's attention.
Yeah. Do you think that there was something, was it a fluke? Was it something specific about those people or that project, or in your, your best judgment, is that widely applicable?
No, I don't think it certainly wasn't luck or a fluke. I think it's just natural. You start to bring in this cross-functional team and these other areas of expertise, and the decisions just get better because you're not narrowing your view, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think that's what they figured out. And that's why it suddenly got really the norm, because they went, this isn't particularly difficult to implement, is it? They go, no, it's going to be harder to manage. Your project managers have to get more comfortable with a little uncertainty in there, and management has to be forgiving of those iterations, but understand we're going to hit the finish line earlier. Up front, it may look a lot more chaotic, and, there's so much iteration going on and it looks like it's taking too long, but all of a sudden it's going to get more and more efficient as it goes, and you're going to get done a lot earlier. And now that's just how development is done.
Yeah. Yeah. Wonderful. All right. Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing so much of your experience and wisdom with all of the listeners. How can people get in touch with you?
The best way is through LinkedIn, either just through my name or through my company, QRx Partners, or there's our website, QRxPartners.com. Keep that pretty simple. But LinkedIn is usually our best approach. We like to encourage people to follow us. We do a lot of posting of really good, interesting information every day. Tuesdays I think is the comedy day, so we put a little funny stuff out there. But the other days of the week, it's useful technical information. And like today was the day we do our warning letter review, where we take a look at FDA warning letters and explain how not to get there.
It sounds tremendously valuable. Great. Well, Steve, thank you again so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.